The trading post smelled of tobacco, leather, and the kind of greed that festered in men who thought a woman traveling alone was easy prey. Grace Vance stood at the weathered counter in Weaverville, California. Her fingers resting lightly on the stack of beaver pelts she had trapped herself over the brutal winter of 1872. The trader, a weasel-faced man named Morton, ran his yellowed fingers across the furs with theatrical slowness, his thin lips pursed in exaggerated consideration. Grace had watched him assess goods from the miners and trappers who frequented his establishment all morning, and she knew quality when she saw it. Her pelts were exceptional, thick and glossy, without a single mar or thin patch. "I will give you $12 for the lot," Morton announced, not meeting her eyes. Grace's jaw tightened. She had counted 23 prime pelts in that stack, each one worth at least $2, more likely $3 given their condition. "Those furs are worth $60 at minimum, and you know it." Morton's expression shifted into something approximating pity, though his eyes remained calculating. "Miss, I understand you might not be familiar with the current market conditions. Beaver has declined significantly. $12 is a generous offer for furs of this quality. Take it or leave it." The rage that bubbled up in Grace's chest was familiar. She had felt it when her father died 6 months ago, leaving her alone on their trap line. She had felt it when the neighboring trappers suggested she sell the cabin and move back east to find a husband. She felt it now, staring at this man who thought her ignorance would line his pockets. "The market has not declined that much," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fury coursing through her veins. "I saw you pay Henderson $20 for 8 pelts just last week, and his were not nearly this quality." Morton's false sympathy evaporated. "Henderson has been trading with me for 15 years. You are nobody. $12. Final offer. Those furs are worth at least $60, and I will not accept a penny less than 50. The trader leaned forward, his breath sour. "Then you can carry them right back out of here, girl. See how far you get trying to transport them to Sacramento on your own. See what happens to a woman traveling alone with valuable goods. There are men on those roads who would take more than just your furs." The threat hung in the air between them, ugly and unmistakable. Grace's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at her belt, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension like an axe through kindling. $65. Grace turned. The man who spoke stood just inside the doorway, and he was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the frame. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and his face was all hard angles and weathered skin, marked by a life spent in the elements. He wore buckskin and furs, and his arms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were corded with muscle that spoke of years swinging axes, hauling traps, and surviving in the wilderness. His eyes, a startling pale blue, were fixed on Morton with an intensity that made the trader take an involuntary step backward. "Excuse me," Morton stammered. The mountain man moved forward with surprising grace for someone his size. Each step was deliberate, purposeful. "I said $65. That is what those pelts are worth, and that is what you will pay her. Now see here, this is my establishment, and I set the prices. You set fair prices." The man's voice was deep, quiet, but it carried an unmistakable edge. "I have been standing outside for the past 10 minutes, listening to you try to cheat this woman. Those are prime beaver pelts. You know it, I know it, and she knows it. You will pay her $65, or I will make certain that every trapper within 50 miles knows that Morton's trading post cheats lone women." Morton's face had gone from sallow to red. "You cannot threaten me in my own store. I am not threatening you. I am correcting a bad deal." The mountain man glanced at Grace, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Madam, do you accept $65 for your furs?" Grace found her voice, though her heart was hammering. "Yes, that is fair." The mountain man turned back to Morton. "Pay her." For a long moment, Morton looked like he might refuse. But the mountain man simply stood there, immovable as stone, his pale eyes never leaving the trader's face. Finally, Morton cursed under his breath and moved to his cash box. He counted out $65 with shaking fingers, slamming the bills and coins onto the counter. Grace gathered the money quickly, tucking it into the leather pouch at her waist. She left the pelts on the counter and turned toward the door, but the mountain man's hand on her elbow stopped her. "You should not walk out alone," he said quietly. "Morton has friends, men who would not think twice about following you and taking that money back." Grace looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. His face was weathered but not old. She guessed him to be perhaps 30 or 31. There was something in his eyes that spoke of loneliness, of long seasons spent in solitude. But there was also steadiness, a kind of quiet honor that made her trust him despite having just met him. "I can handle myself," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were more bravado than truth. She was a decent shot and quick with a knife, but Morton's threat had been real. The roads were dangerous for anyone traveling alone, doubly so for a woman with money. "I am sure you can," the mountain man replied. "But there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered. Where are you headed?" "My cabin. About 8 miles north up in the hills." He nodded once. "I will escort you. My name is Wade Keller, Grace Vance." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for what you did in there." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Morton has been cheating people for years. It was past time someone called him on it." They stepped out into the bright California sunshine. Weaverville was bustling with the usual chaos of a mining town, prospectors and merchants, and painted ladies all moving through the muddy streets. Grace's horse, a sturdy mare named Clementine, was tied outside the trading post next to a massive bay gelding that could only belong to Wade. "That is quite a horse," Grace observed as Wade untied the animal. "Goliath. He has to be big to carry me." Wade swung into the saddle with easy strength, the leather creaking under his weight. "Lead the way, Miss Vance." Grace mounted Clementine and turned the mare north, acutely aware of Wade riding beside her. They moved through Weaverville's Main Street, past the assayer's office and the saloon, and Grace noticed the looks they drew. Several miners tipped their hats to Wade, and one called out a greeting. He seemed to be known here, respected. Once they cleared the town limits, the road narrowed to little more than a trail winding up into the forested hills. The spring air was cool and fresh, scented with pine and wildflowers. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a creek burbled over stones. "How long have you been trapping?" Wade asked after they had ridden in silence for a while. "My father taught me when I was young. I have been doing it on my own since he passed last October." "I am sorry for your loss." The sympathy in his voice sounded genuine, and Grace felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. He was a good man, taught me everything he knew about surviving out here." "He taught you well if you can bring in pelts of that quality." Wade glanced at her, and there was something like admiration in his expression. "Most men cannot trap beaver that clean." Pride warmed her chest. He always said that patience was the most important skill a trapper could have, that and respect for the animal. Wise man. They rode in companionable quiet for a while longer, the horses picking their way carefully up the rocky trail. Grace found herself stealing glances at Wade, trying to understand this man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her. He rode with the ease of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle, his body moving fluidly with Goliath's gait. His hands on the reins were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "You seem to know your way around Weaverville," Grace said eventually. "Do you live nearby?" "I have a camp about 15 miles west, deeper in the mountains. I come to town every few weeks to trade and resupply." He paused, then added, "I saw you in Weaverville once before last winter. You were buying supplies at the general store." Grace searched her memory and found it, a snowy day in January when she had come to town for flour and coffee. She remembered seeing a large man in furs, though she had been too focused on her shopping to pay much attention. "I remember that day," she said. "Why did you not say hello?" Wade's expression was unreadable. "You looked like you did not want to be bothered, and I am not much for conversation with strangers. Yet here you are, riding 8 miles out of your way to escort a stranger home. That is different. You needed help." They reached a fork in the trail, and Grace guided Clementine to the left, up an even narrower path that climbed steeply through dense pine forest. The undergrowth was thick with manzanita and mountain lilac, and the air grew noticeably cooler as they gained elevation. "You not get lonely?" Grace asked. Living alone in the mountains, Wade was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I have never been comfortable around crowds. The wilderness makes more sense to me than people do." "I understand that." "After my father died, several people suggested I move to Sacramento, find work in town. But I cannot imagine living anywhere but here. The mountains feel like home. Not many women would choose this life." Grace bristled slightly. "Not many women are given the choice. Most are expected to marry and keep house, whether that is what they want or not." "I meant no offense," Wade said quickly. "I admire your independence. It takes strength to survive out here alone." The sincerity in his voice softened her reaction. "I am sorry. I have heard a lot of opinions lately about what I should and should not do. It gets tiresome." "I imagine it does." They emerged from the trees onto a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The American River glinted silver in the afternoon sun, and the distant peaks still wore caps of snow despite the spring warmth. Grace pulled Clementine to a halt, as she always did at this spot, to take in the view. Wade stopped beside her. "Beautiful," he said quietly. "It never gets old," Grace agreed. "No matter how many times I see it." They sat there for a moment, the horses standing quietly beneath them, and Grace felt something shift in the air between them. It was not quite comfort, not yet, but a kind of recognition. As though they had each found someone who understood what it meant to choose solitude, to find peace in wild places that others feared. "My cabin is just over this ridge," Grace said finally. "Another mile or so." Wade nodded, and they continued on. The trail descended into a sheltered valley, where a clear stream ran between moss-covered rocks. Grace's cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure her father had built with his own hands 20 years ago. Smoke rose from the chimney, which surprised her until she remembered she had banked the fire before leaving that morning. She dismounted and tied Clementine to the hitching post outside the cabin. Wade swung down from Goliath but remained standing by his horse, as though uncertain whether he should approach any closer. "Would you like to come in?" Grace asked. "It is the least I can offer after you helped me." Wade hesitated, then shook his head. "I should get back. It will be dark in a few hours, and I have a long ride ahead." Disappointment surprised her with its intensity. "Of course. But thank you again, truly. I do not know what would have happened if you had not intervened." "You would have found a way," Wade said. "You strike me as someone who always does." He turned to mount Goliath, but Grace found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "If you are ever near here again, you would be welcome to stop by. For coffee or a meal, it would be nice to have company." Wade looked at her, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw loneliness there and something else, something that made her breath catch. "I would like that," he said quietly. "Thank you, Miss Vance. Grace. Please call me Grace." A smile, small but genuine, crossed his face. "Grace. And you can call me Wade." He mounted Goliath and touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Grace watched him ride away, his broad-shouldered form growing smaller as he descended the trail, until he disappeared into the trees. Only then did she turn and enter her cabin, her mind full of pale blue eyes and a deep voice that had spoken her name like it mattered. The next 2 weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of Grace's life. She checked her trap lines, skinned and prepared the pelts, tended her small vegetable garden, and chopped enough wood to see her through the next winter. But beneath the routine, something had changed. She found herself thinking about Wade at odd moments, remembering the way he had stood up to Morton without hesitation, the quiet strength in his voice, the unexpected gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. She told herself it was foolish. He was a stranger, a man she had met once and would likely never see again. He had been kind to her, nothing more. But when she lay in her bed at night, listening to the wind sigh through the pines, she could not help but wonder if he thought about her too. 3 weeks after their meeting, Grace rode into Weaverville again with another bundle of furs. She had debated whether to go back to Morton's, but ultimately decided to try the trading post on the other side of town instead. The trader there, an older man named Jameson, gave her a fair price without argument, and she left with money in her pocket and a lighter heart. She was loading supplies onto Clementine when she heard a familiar voice. "Grace." She turned to find Wade standing a few feet away, leading Goliath. He looked the same as she remembered, powerfully built and weather-worn, his long hair tied back with a leather cord. But there was something different in his expression, a kind of nervous anticipation that made him seem almost vulnerable. "Wade." Her smile came without thought. "I did not expect to see you again so soon. I had to come to town for supplies." He paused, then added, "And I was hoping I might run into you." Warmth spread through her chest. "I am glad you did." They stood there for a moment, the busy street flowing around them, neither quite sure what to say next. Finally, Wade cleared his throat. "I have been thinking about your offer, of stopping by for coffee." His eyes met hers. "Would the invitation still stand, of course? Are you free now?" "I was just heading home." Something like relief crossed his face. "I would like that very much." They rode out of town together, and this time the silence between them felt different, charged with a tentative possibility. Grace found herself acutely aware of Wade's presence beside her, the way the sun caught in his dark hair, the strength in his hands as he held Goliath's reins. "How has your trapping been?" Wade asked as they climbed into the hills. "Good. I have been working the streams on the north side of my property. The beaver there have been active." She glanced at him. "And yours?" "Fair. I mostly trap marten and fox in the higher elevations. The beaver are scarce where I am. You should try the creek near my cabin." "I have seen signs of beaver there, but I have not set traps yet. The area is too much for me to work alone." Wade looked at her with interest. "Would you want a partner? We could split whatever we catch." The offer surprised and pleased her. "That would be beneficial for both of us." "You are welcome to trap there whenever you like. I could come by tomorrow if that suits you. We could scout the area together, see where the best spots are. Tomorrow would be perfect." They reached Grace's cabin in the late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees in golden bars. Grace showed Wade where to stable Goliath in the small shelter beside Clementine. then led him inside. The cabin was simple but well kept. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies and books. Wade's eyes went to the books, and Grace saw surprise flicker across his face. "My father believed education was as important as knowing how to trap," she explained. "He taught me to read when I was young. Those books have kept me company through many long winters." Wade moved closer to the shelves, his fingers trailing gently over the spines. "Shakespeare, Milton, Defoe, these are fine books. You read." "My mother was a school teacher back in Missouri. She made sure I could read and cipher before I left home." His voice carried a note of old sadness. "I have not held a book in years, though. There is not much call for literature in the wilderness." "You are welcome to borrow any of them," Grace offered. "I have read them all so many times I could probably recite them from memory." Wade turned to her, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost painful to see. "Thank you. That is very kind." Grace busied herself building up the fire and setting coffee to boil. She sliced bread and cheese and brought out some of the dried venison she had prepared last fall. It was a simple meal, but Wade accepted it with obvious appreciation. They sat at the table, and as they ate, conversation came more easily. Wade told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 5 brothers, and how he had headed west at 18 to escape a life he did not want. He spoke of years spent trapping and prospecting, of winters so harsh he had nearly frozen to death, of the quiet satisfaction he found in matching his wits against the wilderness. Grace shared her own story, how her mother had died when she was 10, leaving her and her father to fend for themselves. How her father had treated her not as a daughter who needed to be married off, but as a partner who needed to be taught everything he knew. How she had grown to love the mountains and the freedom they represented. "You never wish for something different?" Wade asked. "A husband, children, a more settled life?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I wonder what that would be like. But I cannot imagine giving up my independence. Most men would expect me to abandon this life to become someone I am not." She met his eyes. "What about you? Have you never wanted a family?" Wade's expression grew distant. "Once. There was a woman in Virginia City years ago. I thought we might have a future together, but she could not accept my need for solitude. She wanted a husband who would stay in town, work a steady job, be home every night. I tried for a while, but I felt like I was suffocating." He paused. "She married a shopkeeper 6 months after I left. I heard they are very happy." "Do you regret it?" "I regret hurting her. But no, I do not regret leaving. It would have been worse to stay and make us both miserable." The honesty in his words resonated with Grace. "I think true partnership means accepting someone as they are, not trying to change them into what you think they should be." "I think you are right." Wade looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You are unlike any woman I have ever met, Grace Vance. Is that a good thing?" His smile was slow and genuine. "It is a very good thing." The light outside had begun to fade, painting the cabin in shades of amber and shadow. Wade stood reluctantly. "I should go. I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You have not imposed at all. I have enjoyed the company." Grace rose as well. "Will you still come tomorrow to check the trap lines? I will be here at first light, if that is not too early." "I am always up with the sun." Wade collected his hat and moved toward the door, but he paused on the threshold. "Grace, I want you to know that what happened today, talking with you, it is the most at ease I have felt with another person in longer than I can remember." Her heart squeezed. "I feel the same way." For a moment she thought he might say something more, might cross the distance between them. But Wade only nodded, touched his hat, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. Grace watched him ride away, and this time the ache of his leaving was sharper, more defined. She lay awake long that night, staring at the dark beams of her ceiling, trying to understand what was happening. She had known Wade for less than a month, had spent perhaps a total of 10 hours in his company. But something about him called to her in a way she had never experienced before. It was not just his physical presence, though she could not deny the way her pulse quickened when she looked at him. It was the recognition she felt, the sense that here was someone who understood the parts of her that others found strange or difficult. Sleep, when it finally came, was full of dreams of pale blue eyes and gentle hands. Wade arrived the next morning just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. Grace had been up for an hour already, had made coffee and packed provisions for a day in the field. When she heard Goliath's hoofbeats approaching, she stepped outside, trying not to seem too eager. Wade dismounted, and Grace felt her breath catch as it had the first time she saw him. In the clear morning light, he was even more impressive, all broad shoulders and contained strength. He had tied his hair back, and she could see the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "I brought my traps and gear. Morning. Coffee is hot if you want some before we head out." They stood in the cabin drinking coffee as the dawn chorus built outside, birds calling to each other in the trees. Wade had brought the volume of Shakespeare from Grace's shelf, and he held it carefully, as though it were something precious. "I started reading Hamlet last night," he said. "I had forgotten how much I missed this. Keep it as long as you like." "I am always happy to share books with someone who appreciates them." Wade looked at her over the rim of his tin cup. "You are a rare woman, Grace. I could say the same about you. You are not like other men I have known. Is that a good thing?" he asked, echoing her question from the night before. She smiled. "It is a very good thing." They finished their coffee and set out, following the creek that ran behind Grace's cabin. The water was high with snowmelt, rushing over rocks and fallen logs in white foam. They walked the banks for over an hour, Wade pointing out signs that Grace had learned to recognize from her father, but that took on new meaning with Wade's expertise. A gnawed branch here, a slide mark in the mud there, the distinctive scent of beaver musk. "This is good territory," Wade said, crouching beside a beaver dam. "Well-established colony. If we trap carefully, we can take a few without disrupting the whole population. My father always said to take only what you need, leave enough for next season." Wade nodded approvingly. "Smart trapping. Too many men clear an area out completely, then wonder why there is nothing left." They spent the morning setting traps, working in easy coordination. Wade's knowledge complemented Grace's, and she found herself learning new techniques, better ways to disguise a trap scent, more effective placement in the water. But more than the practical knowledge, she enjoyed simply being with him. The way he moved through the wilderness with absolute confidence, the quiet competence in his hands, the occasional dry observations that made her laugh. By midday they had set a dozen traps, and Grace led Wade to a spot where the creek widened into a pool surrounded by flat rocks. She unpacked the lunch she had brought, bread and cheese and apples, and they sat in the dappled shade eating and watching the water. "How did you end up in Weaverville?" Grace asked. "It is a long way from Missouri." Wade chewed thoughtfully before answering. "I followed the gold rush west in '64 when I was 18. Spent a few years prospecting in Nevada and Montana, never found much. Realized I was better at trapping than mining. Worked my way south, spent time in Oregon and Northern California. Found these mountains about 5 years ago and decided to stay. Do you ever think about going back to Missouri, to your family?" A shadow crossed his face. "My parents died of cholera when I was 20. My brothers and I were never close. We were too different. They wanted farms and families and church on Sundays. I wanted open country and silence. He looked at her. What about you? Do you have family elsewhere? Just some cousins back in Pennsylvania. My mother's family. We exchange letters once a year or so, but we have nothing in common anymore. They think I am crazy for staying out here. Are you crazy? Grace considered the question. Maybe. But if I am, it is the kind of crazy that makes me happy. Wade's smile was warm. Then it is the best kind of crazy. They finished eating and continued working their way upstream, checking for more potential trap sites. The afternoon grew warm, and Grace found herself increasingly aware of Wade's proximity. When he helped her across a slippery rock, his hand was warm and calloused against hers. When he leaned close to point out a track in the mud, she could smell pine and leather, and something distinctly masculine that made her pulse race. She was falling for him. The realization hit her with surprising clarity as she watched him reset a trap he was not satisfied with, his movements precise and sure. She was falling for this quiet mountain man who read Shakespeare and respected the wilderness and had stood up for her without expecting anything in return. The question was whether he felt the same way. They returned to Grace's cabin in the late afternoon, both muddy and tired but satisfied with the day's work. Wade insisted on helping her with the evening chores, feeding the horses and chopping wood for the fire. Grace cooked dinner, venison stew with wild onions and the last of her winter potatoes, and they ate together as the sun set beyond the western peaks. "I should go," Wade said eventually, though he made no move to rise from the table. "It will be full dark soon." "You could stay," Grace heard herself say. "The ride back to your camp is long, and it is not safe to travel these trails at night. You could sleep by the fire, head out at first light." Wade looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, desire warring with propriety. "Grace, I do not want to compromise your reputation." She almost laughed. "Wade, I live alone in the mountains. My reputation has been compromised since the day I decided to stay here instead of marrying some proper town man. Besides, there is no one around for miles to see or care. Are you sure?" "I am sure. I would worry about you riding that trail in the dark. Please stay." Relief and something warmer flooded his expression. "All right, thank you." Grace spread blankets by the fire for Wade while he tended to the horses one more time. When he returned, she was already in her nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She saw his eyes widen slightly, saw him look away quickly, and felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Good night, Wade," she said softly. "Good night, Grace." She climbed into her bed in the corner, acutely aware of Wade settling onto the blankets just 20 feet away. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the crackle of the fire and Wade's steady breathing, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Grace woke before dawn to find Wade already up, crouched by the fire and coaxing it back to life. She rose quietly and began making coffee, and they moved around each other in the small space with surprising ease, as though they had been doing this for years rather than days. "I should check my camp," Wade said over breakfast. "Make sure everything is secure there, but I could come back in a few days to check the traps we set." Disappointment settled in Grace's chest, but she kept her voice light. "That would be good. We should check them regularly." Wade hesitated, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Grace, I want to be honest with you about something." Her heart began to pound. "All right. I find myself thinking about you, more than I should, more than is probably wise given that we have only just met." He set down the cup and looked at her directly. "I enjoy your company more than I have enjoyed anyone's in years, and if I am reading the signs wrong, if you do not feel the same way, tell me now and I will not mention it again." We can just be friends and business partners." Grace felt as though all the air had left the room. "You are not reading the signs wrong," she managed. "I feel the same way." The smile that broke across Wade's face was like sunrise. "Then I would like to court you properly if you will let me. I know I am not much of a catch, just a mountain man with no prospects and questionable social graces, but I would like to try." Grace stood and crossed to where he sat, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Wade Keller, you are exactly the kind of catch I want. Yes, I will let you court me." Wade rose to his feet, towering over her, and reached out to cup her face with one large hand. His palm was rough against her cheek, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "May I kiss you, please?" He bent his head and kissed her softly, carefully, as though she were something precious and breakable. Grace's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady thunder of his heartbeat. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I will be back in 3 days, Wade said, his voice rough. "Is that too soon?" "It is not soon enough, but I can wait 3 days. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace felt heat pool in her belly, but Wade pulled back with obvious reluctance. 3 days, he repeated. "I promise." Grace walked him outside and watched him ride away, but this time she was not sad. This time she knew he was coming back. The next 3 days were the longest of Grace's life. She threw herself into work, checking trap lines, tending her garden, cleaning the cabin until it shone. But underneath all the activity, anticipation hummed through her veins. She found herself planning meals, washing her hair with the precious lavender soap she saved for special occasions, trying on her 2 good dresses to see which suited her better. She felt like a girl again, giddy and nervous and full of hope. Wade returned on the 3rd day exactly when he said he would, just after dawn. Grace heard Goliath approaching and ran outside, all pretense of dignity forgotten. Wade dismounted and caught her as she threw herself into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around before setting her down and kissing her breathless. "I missed you," he said against her mouth. "I missed you too." They checked the trap lines together and found they had caught 3 beaver, good-sized animals with prime pelts. They worked side by side to process them, and Grace marveled at how natural it felt, how easily they moved together. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Wade would spend 3 or 4 days at Grace's cabin, helping with traps and chores, sleeping by her fire. Then he would return to his camp for a day or 2 to check his own trap lines and maintain his gear. Each time he returned, the joy in Grace's chest grew stronger until she could no longer imagine her life without him in it. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams for the future. Wade spoke of his desire to build a permanent cabin somewhere in these mountains, to put down real roots for the first time in his life. Grace confessed her fear that she would spend her life alone, that no man would ever understand or accept her need for independence. "I would never ask you to give up who you are," Wade told her one night as they sat by the fire. "Your strength is one of the things I love most about you." Grace's breath caught. "Love?" Wade turned to her, his pale eyes intense. "Yes, love, I love you, Grace Vance. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing up to Morton, refusing to be cheated. I love your courage and your stubbornness, and the way you read Shakespeare by firelight. I love that you are as comfortable skinning a beaver as you are discussing literature. I love everything about you." Tears stung Grace's eyes. "I love you too, Wade. I did not think it was possible to feel this way about someone, but you have shown me otherwise." Wade pulled her into his arms, and they kissed with a passion that left them both shaking. "Marry me," Wade whispered against her hair. "Let me build a life with you here, We can expand your cabin, work the trap lines together, spend our winters reading books and our summers exploring these mountains. Say yes, Grace." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married 6 weeks later in Weaverville, in a simple ceremony with Jameson the trader and his wife as witnesses. Grace wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and Wade wore new buckskins he had made specially for the occasion. When the circuit judge pronounced them man and wife, Wade kissed Grace with such tenderness that even the judge looked moved. They returned to the cabin, which would now be their cabin, and began the work of building a life together. Wade proved to be a skilled carpenter, and he expanded the original structure, adding a second room and a larger storage area. They worked the trap lines together through the summer and fall, building up a store of pelts that would bring good money when they sold them. But more than the practical aspects of their partnership, Grace treasured the intimacy they shared. Wade was a considerate lover, patient and gentle, and their nights together became a source of joy that Grace had never anticipated. During the day, they were partners in the truest sense, each bringing their own skills and knowledge to their shared work. In the evenings, they read to each other from Grace's books, or simply sat in comfortable silence watching the fire. The first winter they spent as husband and wife was hard, as all winters in the mountains were. Snow fell for weeks at a time, sometimes piling so high they could barely open the cabin door. But inside they were warm and safe, and Grace found that even the darkest, coldest days were bearable with Wade beside her. "Are you happy?" Wade asked her one night in February, as wind howled outside and snow battered the windows. Grace looked at him, this strong, gentle man who had changed her entire life, and smiled. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and coaxing green things from the earth." Grace discovered she was pregnant in April, and Wade's joy was so profound it brought tears to both their eyes. He became even more protective than before, insisting she rest more, taking on the heavier chores himself. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Grace protested, even as she was secretly pleased by his concern. "I know, but let me take care of you anyway. You have been taking care of yourself for so long. Let me share that burden now." Their son was born in December, during the first major snowstorm of the winter. Wade delivered the baby himself, his large hands steady and sure, and when he placed the squalling infant in Grace's arms, she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "What should we name him?" Wade asked, his finger gently stroking their son's tiny hand. "William," Grace said. "After your father." Wade's eyes met hers, full of love and gratitude. "William Keller, it is perfect." The years that followed were full of the kind of happiness Grace had once thought existed only in stories. They raised William in the wilderness, teaching him to trap and fish and raid, giving him both practical skills and education. When William was 3, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Hannah, and 2 years after that, another son they called James. The cabin grew along with their family, Wade adding rooms and improvements until it was a proper homestead. They acquired more land, filing claims on the surrounding territory and building a life that was both wild and settled, isolated and complete. Grace never regretted her choice to stay in the mountains, to build a life on her own terms. And Wade never gave her cause to doubt his love or his commitment to the partnership they had forged. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch they had built together, watching their children play in the meadow below. William, now 9, was teaching Hannah and James to identify animal tracks, his young voice patient and clear. "You ever miss your old life?" Grace asked Wade, leaning against his shoulder. "The solitude, the freedom to wander," Wade wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "I have more freedom now than I ever did alone, and the solitude I have with you is better than any I knew before. This right here is everything I ever wanted and never thought I could have." Grace tilted her face up to kiss him, tasting coffee and contentment. "I feel the same way." As the sun set over the mountains they both loved, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace reflected on the day she had walked into that trading post so many years ago. She had gone there seeking fair payment for her furs, and she had found instead a man who valued her strength, cherished her independence, and loved her with a depth and constancy that still took her breath away. The trader had tried to cheat her, but Wade had corrected more than just that deal. He had corrected the course of her entire life, showing her that she did not have to choose between independence and love, that the right partner would celebrate her wildness rather than try to tame it. Their children's laughter echoed across the valley as darkness fell, and Grace felt Wade's hand tighten around hers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all days did in the mountains. Traps to check, wood to chop, animals to feed, lessons to teach. But they would face it all together, as they had faced everything since that spring day in Weaverville when a mountain man had stood up for a woman he did not know and changed both their lives forever. "I love you," Wade murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Grace replied. "Always and forever." And in that moment, with her family around her and the man she loved at her side, Grace Vance Keller knew that she had everything she had ever needed. The mountains had given her solitude and strength, but Wade had given her something infinitely more precious. He had given her a partnership built on mutual respect, a love that honored who she was rather than trying to change her, and a family that thrived in the wilderness they both called home. The stars began to emerge overhead, countless and bright, and Grace thought of all the years still ahead of them. More children perhaps, grandchildren eventually, a lifetime of seasons spent working together and loving each other in this place they had made their own. William called out that he had spotted a fox in the tree line, and Wade rose to go look with him, lifting James onto his shoulders so the little boy could see. Hannah ran to Grace, climbing into her lap and nestling against her chest. "Tell me the story again, Mama," Hannah said. "About how you and Papa met." Grace smiled and began the tale, as she had told it 100 times before and would tell it 100 times more. The story of a trader who tried to cheat her, and a mountain man who corrected the deal and escorted her out safely, and how that single act of decency had led to a love that would last them all their days. As she spoke, Wade returned with the boys, and they all settled on the porch together, the children leaning against their parents in drowsy contentment. This was her life now, Grace thought. Not the solitary existence she had once imagined for herself, but something richer and fuller than she had ever dreamed possible. The wilderness still called to her, as it always would. But now, when she answered that call, she did not go alone. She went with Wade at her side, her partner in all things, the man who had seen her strength and loved her for it rather than despite it. The night deepened around them, and eventually Wade carried the sleeping children inside while Grace banked the fire and locked the doors. They climbed into their bed together as they had done thousands of nights before, and Wade pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "Thank you," he whispered in the darkness. "For what?" "For saying yes that day. For taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not have much to offer except his whole heart." Grace turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "You gave me everything I needed, Wade Keller. You gave me love and partnership and a life beyond anything I could have built alone. I should be thanking you." "Then we will thank each other," Wade said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Every day for the rest of our lives. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in their love and their life together. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and magnificent, sheltering the family that had made their home among the peaks and valleys. The wilderness that had once been Grace's refuge had become her kingdom, and Wade, her mountain man, her king. The years continued to unfold in a tapestry of seasons and small joys. The children grew strong and capable, learning the skills they would need to thrive in the mountain wilderness. William proved to have his father's patience and his mother's sharp mind, becoming an expert trapper by the time he was 15. Hannah inherited Grace's love of books and Wade's gentle strength, equally comfortable reading poetry or skinning game. James was the wild one, adventurous and bold, always pushing boundaries and exploring new territories. When William turned 21, he married a young woman from Weaverville, a teacher's daughter who had come west with her family and fallen in love with both William and the mountains. Wade helped them build a cabin 5 miles north, close enough to visit regularly but far enough for privacy. Grace cried at her son's wedding, but they were happy tears, grateful that William had found someone who understood and shared his love for this life. Hannah chose a different path. She moved to Sacramento at 18 to attend a women's seminary, determined to become a teacher herself. Grace understood, though she missed her daughter terribly. Hannah wrote long letters describing her studies and her life in the city, and she came home every summer, bringing books and stories of the wider world. James, true to his nature, became a prospector and explorer, spending months at a time in the high country searching for gold and silver. He rarely found much, but the search itself seemed to fulfill something in him. He always returned to the family homestead eventually, sunburned and lean and full of stories. Through it all, Wade and Grace remained each other's constant. They grew older together, their bodies marked by the passage of time and the hard work of mountain life. Wade's hair turned silver, and Grace's hands grew gnarled with arthritis. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened with each passing year, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which everything else in their lives was built. On Grace's 50th birthday, Wade surprised her with a gift he had been working on in secret for months. It was a rocking chair, beautifully crafted from oak he had hauled up from the valley, with their names and wedding date carved into the headrest. Grace wept when she saw it, running her fingers over the smooth wood and the careful letters. "So you will be comfortable when we sit on the porch in the evenings," Wade explained. "My joints are getting creaky too. I figured we have earned the right to sit in comfort while we watch the sun go down." They spent countless evenings in those chairs, Wade in the one he made for himself and Grace in hers, holding hands and talking or simply sitting in the companionable silence that only long-married couples can truly appreciate. They watched their grandchildren play in the meadow where their own children had played, marveling at how quickly time passed and how blessed their lives had been. When Wade was 60, he took a bad fall while chopping wood, breaking several ribs and wrenching his back. Grace nursed him through the recovery, as fierce and determined in her care of him as she had been in everything else she had ever done. Wade chafed at being bedridden, but he submitted to Grace's ministrations with as much grace as he could muster. "You have taken care of me all these years," Grace told him firmly when he protested that he should be up and working. "Let me return the favor now." Wade recovered, though he was never quite as strong as he had been before. He moved more slowly, tired more easily. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Grace never wavered. They adjusted their routines, taking on less demanding work, relying more on William and their other children for help with the heavy labor. Grace's health remained good until her 65th year, when a persistent cough that she dismissed as a winter cold turned into pneumonia. Wade sat by her bedside for 3 weeks, refusing to leave her side, holding her hand and reading to her from the Shakespeare volume he had borrowed from her shelves more than 40 years ago, and never returned. Grace recovered, but the illness took something from her. She tired more easily and the winters became harder to endure. Wade suggested they might consider moving to town, somewhere warmer and less isolated, but Grace refused. "I have lived in these mountains for over 60 years," she said. "I will die in these mountains. That is not negotiable." Wade understood. He felt the same way. So they stayed, supported by their children and grandchildren, who made sure they were never without food or firewood or company. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the homestead for a celebration. William and his wife, their 4 children and 7 grandchildren. Hannah, who had never married but had built a successful career as a teacher and headmistress in Sacramento. James and his young bride, married just a year before. The cabin and surrounding buildings were full of people, laughter, and love. Grace looked around at all the faces, all the lives that had sprung from her union with Wade, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. They had built something remarkable here, something that would endure long after they were gone. Wade stood and raised his glass, calling for silence. When everyone had quieted, he looked at Grace, his pale blue eyes still as clear and intense as they had been the day they met. 50 years ago, he began, I walked into a trading post in Weaverville and saw a woman being cheated. I could have walked away. I could have minded my own business. But something told me to intervene, to stand up for what was right. I had no idea that simple act would lead to this. He gestured around the room at their assembled family. To a love that has sustained me through every hardship, every joy, every moment of these 5 decades. Grace Vance Keller, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a home, a family, a purpose. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. Grace could not speak through her tears, so she simply stood and went to him, and they embraced while their family cheered and applauded around them. The party lasted until well after dark, and when the last guests had finally departed or settled into their beds, Wade and Grace sat together on the porch in their rocking chairs, wrapped in blankets against the cool night air. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. For valuing me. For building this life with me." She squeezed his hand. "For correcting that deal all those years ago." Wade brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "That was the easiest decision I ever made. Everything good in my life came from that moment." They sat in silence, rocking slowly, watching the stars wheel overhead. Grace felt a deep peace settle over her, a sense of completion. Whatever time they had left, whether it was days or years, she knew they would face it together. And when the end came, as it eventually would for both of them, she would go without regrets, secure in the knowledge that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would endure. The years that remained were gentle ones. Wade and Grace grew frailer, but they remained fiercely independent, accepting help only when absolutely necessary. They spent their days in quiet companionship, reminiscing about the past, enjoying the present, and watching their family grow and thrive. Wade died first, peacefully in his sleep on a clear winter morning in his 73rd year. Grace woke to find him gone, his hand still clasped in hers, his face serene. She did not cry at first. She simply sat with him, memorizing every line of his beloved face, grateful that he had been spared a long, painful decline. William found them hours later, still sitting together, and he gently pried his mother's hand from his father's. "He is at peace, Mama," William said softly. "I know," Grace replied. "He was always at peace in these mountains. He is home." They buried Wade on a hill overlooking the valley in a spot he had pointed out years ago as the most beautiful view on their property. Grace stood by the grave long after everyone else had gone, saying her private goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her love, her everything for more than 50 years. Grace lived another 2 years after Wade's death. She remained in the cabin they had built together, refusing all suggestions that she move in with William or Hannah. The loneliness was profound, but Grace bore it with the same strength she had brought to every other challenge in her life. She spent her final years reading, writing letters to her children and grandchildren, and taking slow walks around the property when weather permitted. She visited Wade's grave every day, sitting beside it and talking to him about small things, news of the family, memories of their life together. On a spring morning, almost exactly 53 years after she had met Wade in that Weaverville trading post, Grace woke feeling different. She knew, with the certainty that sometimes comes at the end, that this was her last day. She rose slowly, dressed in her best dress, and walked outside. The mountains were glorious in the morning light, painted in shades of green and gold. Grace made her way up the hill to Wade's grave and sat down beside it, her back against the headstone William had carved. "I am coming, my love," she whispered. "I kept my promise. I stayed in these mountains, in the home we built together. But now it is time to go." Hannah found her there that afternoon when she arrived for her weekly visit. Grace had passed peacefully, a small smile on her weathered face, one hand resting on Wade's headstone. They buried her beside Wade, their graves side by side on the hill overlooking the valley they had loved. The family gathered again, 3 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who had chosen independence and found love, who had built a life on her own terms and left a legacy of strength and courage. William stood at the graveside, now an old man himself, and spoke of his parents' love, of the example they had set, of the lessons they had taught about living authentically and loving completely. "My father once told me," William said, "that the best thing he ever did was stand up for my mother in that trading post. He said it changed his life, but I think it changed all our lives. Because from that one act of decency, from that willingness to do what was right, came a love story that spanned 5 decades and produced all of us. We are all here because Wade Keller saw a woman being cheated and chose to correct the deal." As the sun set over the mountains, the family said their final goodbyes and departed, leaving Wade and Grace together in the place they had made their own. The wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a creek burbled over stones, the same water that had run there when Grace and Wade first set their traps together all those years ago. The cabin stood for another generation, home to William's children and eventually his grandchildren, before time and weather finally reclaimed it. But the story lived on, passed down through the family, a tale of courage and love and the way a single moment of integrity can change the course of multiple lives. Grace had gone into that trading post seeking fair payment for her furs. She had left with something far more valuable, though she did not know it at the time. She had left with the beginning of a love story that would sustain her through 53 years of joy and hardship, that would produce children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that would prove that independence and partnership were not mutually exclusive, that the right person would celebrate your strength rather than try to diminish it. The trader had tried to cheat her on the price, but the mountain man had corrected the deal and escorted her out safely. And from that moment, Both their lives had been forever changed, forever blessed, forever intertwined in a love that even death could not diminish. In the valley below their resting place, the American River continued its eternal journey toward the sea, carrying with it the memories and stories of all who had lived and loved in these mountains. The wilderness remained, eternal and magnificent, a testament to the wild beauty that had called to both Wade and Grace and given them the freedom to build a life unlike any other. And on quiet mornings, when the light hit the mountains just right, it was almost possible to imagine two figures sitting on a cabin porch, holding hands and watching the sunrise, their love still echoing through the hills and valleys they had made their home. A reminder that the best deals in life are not about money or goods, but about finding someone who sees your worth and chooses to stand beside you, come what may.